The first time Karen broke into my garage, I didn't even bother running outside. I just sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, and watched it unfold on the security feed like a late-night sitcom rerun. There she was, bathrobe flapping, hair wound tight like a crown, clipboard in hand, jiggling my garage handle at 2 in the morning. Most people would have looked insane. But Karen? She looked self-important, like she was hosting a property inspection on primetime television. What she didn't know, what made me lean back and laugh into my coffee, was that my alarm system didn't just shriek when triggered. It automatically called the emergency contact list tied to the HOA's phone tree. And thanks to paperwork Karen herself had filed months ago, that list still had her husband Greg at the top. So when the alarm wailed, the siren echoing down the street like a banshee, Greg's phone lit up on his nightstand. And within 90 seconds, I saw him barreling down the sidewalk in slippers, arms pumping, face twisted in panic. He caught her in the act. My camera zoomed in perfectly. Greg yanking her by the elbow, Karen screeching like he'd insulted royalty, the alarm wailing behind them as if applauding. It was poetic. That was the moment I realized I'd inherited more than just a modest ranch-style house when I moved back here. I'd inherited a war. It wasn't supposed to be this way. After 22 years in the army, most of them spent bouncing between war zones, I came home to rebuild something simple. My father's land had been whittled down over the years, my brother had sold off his share, and all I wanted was to tend to what was left. Cracked soil, a 2-bedroom rancher with weathered siding, and the old red barn that creaked like it had secrets. I wasn't looking for neighbors, or drama, or community politics. Just quiet. But quiet is the one thing Karen couldn't tolerate. From the moment I parked my truck on the cracked driveway, she was there. Clipboard in hand, smile tight enough to snap a tooth. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, before rattling off the community standards, like she was reading commandments from stone tablets. Grass no longer than 3 inches. Mailboxes aligned at a 90-degree angle. Garages free of unsightly storage. I'd barely unloaded my duffel before she was asking for my HOA dues and reminding me that she, as vice president, was the face of this neighborhood. I thanked her politely, closed the door, and made a note: never underestimate the enemy. The first few weeks were manageable. Notices taped to my door, passive-aggressive emails about unsanctioned equipment parked in my driveway, by which she meant my dad's old tractor, and her sudden appearances whenever I so much as coiled a hose wrong. Annoying but survivable. But the garage was different. That was my line. The garage was where I'd set up everything I cared about. Dad's tools, the rebuilt tractor engine, the battered footlocker from my deployments, the file cabinet stuffed with paperwork. It wasn't just a garage. It was the last piece of order I could control. So when Karen broke in, clipboard under her arm, muttering about community inspections, something in me clicked. The alarm screamed. Lights flashed. And Greg, poor Greg, stumbled into frame like a man who'd already lived this scene too many times. On the feed, I watched him grab her wrist. She twisted, yanking free, pointing at my camera like it was a sniper scope. Her mouth moved fast, words lost under the siren, but I didn't need audio. I'd seen enough interrogations to recognize someone building their defense even while caught red-handed. Finally, Greg dragged her down the driveway, slippers slapping, bathrobe tangling around her ankles. The siren cut off when I reset it from my phone, the silence almost as loud as the noise had been. I sat back, staring at the frozen image on the screen. Karen mid-scream. Greg mid-drag. The garage still locked. I should have been angry. Any other homeowner would have been. But anger burns fast, and I'd learned long ago that patience is deadlier. Karen wanted to play queen. I was fine letting her. Queens fall hardest when the crowd sees the crown is made of tin. The next morning, the war came to my doorstep, literally. A bright yellow violation notice taped to my front door, written in Karen's jagged handwriting. Improper garage security fixtures, it read. My alarm system, according to her, was a danger to community tranquility. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Let me get this straight. She broke into my garage, set off my alarm, dragged her own husband into a midnight circus, and now I was the problem? I peeled the notice off, smoothed it flat, and filed it in a folder labeled Karen's Greatest Hits. It was the first of many. As I walked back inside, I spotted Greg across the street, hunched over his car, pretending to check the oil. He glanced up, caught my eye, and mouthed sorry. I gave him a nod. He looked like a man apologizing not just for last night, but for every moment he'd been chained to Karen's crusades. That's when it clicked. Greg wasn't her accomplice. He was her prisoner. It didn't make me pity him. Not yet. But it did make me wonder how long a man can live in the blast radius of someone else's war before he turns to shrapnel. That evening, I sat in the garage, door open, tools spread across the workbench. Let her see me. Let her know I wasn't hiding. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching across the driveway. I heard the unmistakable clip-clop of her heels before I saw her. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, hands on hips, clipboard tucked under her arm like a sidearm. "You violated code," she said flatly. "By locking my garage? By installing unauthorized alarm equipment." I leaned against the workbench, wiped grease from my hands. Funny. I thought breaking into someone else's garage was unauthorized. Her face tightened. "Don't be dramatic." "Trust me," I said. "You haven't seen dramatic." She huffed, scribbled something on her clipboard, and stormed off. I watched her go, her bathrobe now swapped for a blazer, her crown still firmly invisible but heavy all the same. When the garage door rolled shut behind me, I realized something important. This wasn't just about bylaws or alarm systems or even a nosy neighbor. This was about power. Karen needed it like oxygen, and anyone who didn't bow was suffocating her. She'd come into my garage to prove she could. To prove there was nowhere I could close her out. But she'd tripped my alarm. And worse, she'd tripped her husband. She thought she was in control. She didn't realize she'd already set her own trap. And me? I was perfectly happy to let her keep pulling the rope. Because the thing about alarms is, once they're triggered, everyone hears the noise. When the alarm screamed through the neighborhood and Karen's husband, Greg, came barreling down the sidewalk in his slippers, I thought the circus was over. He yanked his wife out of my garage, muttered something about overreacting again, and dragged her home. But if I've learned anything from my short tenure under the HOA's watchful eye, it's that Karen never retreats. She reloads. The morning after the break-in, I opened my blinds and found a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. Big block letters at the top read, "Urgent HOA violation." The crime? Improper garage security fixtures. According to Karen's handwritten addendum at the bottom, my alarm system was too aggressive and caused community distress. Apparently, a siren wailing because someone trespassed into a private garage was an aesthetic offense on par with leaving Christmas lights up in June. I pulled the notice down, poured myself coffee, and stared at it across the kitchen table. My first instinct was to laugh. My second was to grab a hammer and nail it right back onto her door. Instead, I folded it, slid it into a file labeled Karen's Greatest Hits, and went about my morning. Retaliation had to be earned. I preferred to let her build her own gallows, one forged HOA complaint at a time. By noon, though, the escalation was clear. Karen wasn't satisfied with a notice. She was outside with a clipboard, taking photos of my driveway, my hedges, even the bird feeder hanging from a maple tree. I leaned against the doorframe and waved. She snapped another picture like I'd committed a felony. Greg ambled behind her, looking less like a husband and more like a parole officer forced to babysit. He caught my eye and mouthed sorry. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. That evening, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A sharp voice barked, "This is the HOA president. We've received multiple complaints about your alarm." It was Karen, of course. She didn't even disguise her voice well. You mean the alarm that only goes off when someone breaks into my garage? I asked. That alarm is disruptive. It nearly gave Mrs. Patterson a heart attack. Mrs. Patterson lives 2 streets over. Sound travels. So does gossip. There was a pause. Then Karen snapped, You will disable that system immediately or face fines. I let silence drag until she demanded, Are you listening? Loud and clear, I said, then hung up. I doubted she'd ever heard anyone hang up on her before. That made it worth it. The following day, my retaliation plan began in earnest, though quietly. I called my alarm company and had them tweak the system. Now, whenever the alarm tripped, it not only blared sirens but also triggered a phone call to all listed emergency contacts. That included me, of course. But also, thanks to Karen's handiwork with the HOA's phone tree, Greg's number was still registered under Neighborhood Emergency Contact. Every time Karen tested my patience, she'd inadvertently be summoning her own husband again. I didn't have to wait long. 2 nights later, I was in bed when the alarm shrieked. I checked the camera feed. Karen was in my driveway with a flashlight, peering into my garage windows like a raccoon hunting scrap. The alarm blared, my phone buzzed, and somewhere across the street, Greg's ringtone wailed. By the time I got outside, Greg was stomping up the driveway, robe flapping. For God's sake, Karen, he shouted. Do you know what time it is? I was just checking for code violations, she snapped. At midnight. She whirled on me. You see what you've done? You're dividing families now. I raised an eyebrow. Pretty sure you're managing that on your own. Greg sighed so hard it sounded like resignation in physical form. He grabbed her wrist and dragged her away again, muttering apologies. The next morning, another notice appeared on my door. Illegal bird feeder installation. I stared at it, then at the actual feeder, a plain wooden thing my niece had built in shop class. The violation? Encourages unsightly wildlife activity. The unsightly wildlife in question was a pair of robins. I decided it was time to step up the game. Not by removing the feeder, but by upgrading. I bought 2 more, brighter and bigger, and hung them from the front tree like ornament. If Karen wanted to nitpick, I'd give her a forest. Sure enough, by the weekend, she was in my yard again, camera clicking furiously. This time, though, Greg wasn't trailing behind. Instead, he was sitting on their porch, head in his hands, watching his wife spiral deeper into obsession. That night, the phone rang again. Greg's voice, low and tired. Look, man, I don't know what she's doing anymore. She says you're some kind of threat to the neighborhood. She's filing reports left and right. I can't stop her. You could try, I said. He gave a humorless laugh. You don't know her like I do. She won't quit until she feels like she's won. Then maybe she should pick battles she can win. The silence stretched. Finally, he muttered, Just watch your back. She's not going to let this go. Then he hung up. I sat back in my chair, staring at the phone. For once, Greg didn't sound like the spineless sidekick to her HOA crusade. He sounded like a man bracing for collateral damage. The next escalation came fast. Saturday morning, I woke to hammering. I stepped outside to find Karen on a ladder, hammering a laminated sign onto the utility pole by my driveway. In block letters, Security System Alert, Aggressive Homeowner. Beneath it, a grainy printout of my face from what looked like a doorbell camera still. You can't post that! I shouted. She glared down at me. The community has a right to know who's endangering it. You're trespassing again. HOA jurisdiction overrides private property when community safety is at stake, she declared, pounding another nail. At that moment, Greg appeared, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He grabbed the ladder and yanked it back. Karen screeched, clutching the pole as the sign dangled. That's enough, he barked. You're not dragging me into court again over this nonsense. Karen shrieked about neighbors' rights and neighborhood standards, but Greg ripped the sign down and tossed it in my yard. His hands shook. For the first time, I realized he wasn't just embarrassed, he was scared. That night, my cameras caught Karen pacing her yard, phone in hand, whispering furiously into it. A plan was brewing, one even Greg wasn't in on. And that's when I realized the real escalation wasn't the notices or the photos or even the midnight inspections. It was Karen herself, unraveling thread by thread, until the only thing left holding her together was the illusion of authority. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the thought settle. If she wanted war, I could play the long game. Because the louder she screamed, the easier it would be for the entire neighborhood to finally hear the truth. The morning after the sign fiasco, I walked outside to find 3 cars parked across the street. Not the usual sedans belonging to neighbors, but spotless SUVs lined up like they were staging an intervention. From each emerged a figure in a matching polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo. It was like a discount SWAT team, minus the competence. Karen led them, clipboard clutched like a scepter. She strode into my yard, chin high, eyes gleaming with the triumph of someone convinced she'd finally cornered her prey. Per HOA Bylaw 47C, she announced, we are here to conduct an unscheduled property inspection. I leaned against my truck and sipped coffee. Funny. Last I checked, this was private property, not a petting zoo. She ignored me and gestured for her entourage to fan out. One began measuring the height of my grass with a tape measure. Another took pictures of my driveway from 6 angles. The third squatted by the bird feeders, scribbling notes like he'd just uncovered a crime scene. I sipped again. Do I get a copy of the inspection report, or is this more of a dramatic reading? Karen whirled on me. You will remain silent while we assess compliance. Not likely. Greg shuffled up behind them, his hair uncombed, shirt half-buttoned. Karen, maybe this isn't the... She cut him off. Greg, document the mailbox. It leans 2 degrees left. He looked at me, then back at her, then pulled out his phone with the resignation of a man who knew resistance was futile. By the time they finished, my lawn looked like it had hosted an amateur archaeological dig. Karen handed me a stack of papers, citations for everything from unsightly garden hose placement to unapproved exterior security devices. I flipped through. 7 violations in one morning. That's ambitious. What's the record? You'll be fined accordingly, she said, her smile thin and victorious. I folded the stack and slid it into my file. Great. Keep them coming. I'm building quite the scrapbook. Her smile faltered. She wasn't used to targets who didn't beg for mercy. That evening, I scanned the fine print on each violation. Most were laughably vague, but one caught my attention. Unauthorized alarm system, HOA board vote pending revocation. That was the real battle. Karen wasn't content to complain. She was maneuvering to ban my security system outright. Fine. If she wanted to weaponize bureaucracy, I could do the same. I pulled up the HOA's own bylaws, which I downloaded after her first notice. Buried in the dense legalese was a gem. Any homeowner could request a hearing before the full board, with mandatory minutes recorded and open attendance for other residents. If Karen wanted a public fight, I'd drag her obsession into the light of day. 2 days later, I filed my request. The board scheduled the hearing for the following Thursday. Word spread fast. By the weekend, neighbors I barely knew were stopping me in the street. Hey, are you the guy fighting Karen about the alarm? One asked, grinning. That'd be me. Good luck. She's been a nightmare for years. Another neighbor, an older man with a cane, muttered, "'Bout time someone stood up to her. She fined me for painting my shed door the wrong shade of beige." I realized something crucial then. Karen thought she represented the HOA. In reality, she'd been terrorizing the community under the guise of authority. My fight wasn't just mine anymore, it was everyone's. The hearing was held in the clubhouse, a beige building with folding chairs and bad fluorescent lighting. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by her hand-picked allies. Greg sat a few rows back, looking like he wanted the earth to swallow him. The rest of the room was packed with neighbors, whispering, waiting. Karen banged a gavel like she was presiding over a federal trial. This hearing is called to address homeowner noncompliance with community standard. The homeowner in question has installed an unauthorized alarm system that disrupts neighborhood tranquility. She gestured at me. You may state your defense, though it is futile. I stood. Thanks, Your Honor. I'll keep it brief. My alarm goes off when someone breaks into my garage. Last I checked, preventing crime isn't a violation of community standards. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen slammed the gavel. Irrelevant. The issue is the disruptive noise. Disruptive to who? I asked. Because as far as I can tell, the only person triggering it is you. The room chuckled. Even a few board members smiled before quickly hiding it. Karen's face flushed. That is not the point. Actually, it is. You've cited me for feeding birds, for how my hose is coiled, for the angle of my mailbox. But the real issue here is that you don't like being reminded you don't control everything. Gasp. Whispers. Greg sank lower in his chair. Karen tried to regain control, flipping through her papers. The system is unapproved. It must be removed. I pulled out the bylaws. Funny thing, page 73, subsection G. Homeowners may install private security systems provided they do not interfere with communal infrastructure. My system isn't tied to anything but my property, which means it's perfectly legal. I handed copies to the board. One member adjusted his glasses, reading aloud. Karen's eyes widened as her power slipped like sand through her fingers. The board conferred in hushed tones, then the president, not Karen, but a man named Feldman I'd barely seen before, cleared his throat. The board finds no violation. The homeowner may keep his alarm. Applause erupted. Some neighbors even cheered. Karen pounded the gavel so hard it cracked. This is outrageous, she shrieked. You're all blind to the danger he poses. Feldman frowned. That's enough, Karen. This matter is closed. But Karen wasn't done. She spun on me, eyes blazing. You think this is over? I will not stop until you are gone from this community. I smiled. Good to know. Saves me the trouble of wondering. The meeting adjourned. Neighbors clapped me on the back as we filed out. One whispered, You just did what we've all wanted to for years. Outside, under the yellow glow of the parking lot lights, Greg approached me. His face was pale, his voice low. You just humiliated her in front of everyone. She won't forgive that. I'm counting on it, I said. He shook his head. You don't understand. She's already talking about drastic measures. She won't stop with notices and hearings. She's going to cross a line. I studied him. For once, he didn't look beaten down. He looked scared. Not for himself, for me. Then maybe it's time she learns what happens when she does, I said. He hesitated, then muttered, I'll try to keep her from doing something stupid. But you'd better be ready. That night, as I reviewed the footage from my security cameras, I saw Karen pacing her driveway again, phone pressed to her ear, her gestures sharp and erratic. She was plotting something new, something bigger. And for the first time, I wondered if even Greg could stop her this time. The night after the HOA hearing, the neighborhood felt different. For once, people weren't avoiding eye contact or whispering behind blinds. They waved when I walked the dog. Some even smiled. It was subtle, but I could tell the balance had shifted. Karen had ruled by intimidation for so long that most people forgot she only had power if they handed it to her. But after I'd thrown her theatrics back in her face in front of the entire board, her grip loosened. Of course, loosening wasn't the same as broken. Karen's entire identity was built on being the queen of the cul-de-sac. Public humiliation wasn't something she could swallow. And when people like Karen feel control slipping, they don't retreat. They double down. It started small. The next morning, I found eggs smashed across my truck windshield. The cameras caught the thrower in full detail. Karen herself, skulking in her robe, hurling eggs like she was back in high school. I didn't even bother confronting her. I printed still shots, slid them into my file, and cleaned the glass. 2 days later, the sprinklers mysteriously shut off. I checked the irrigation control box. The lock had been snapped clean, wires clipped. Again, the camera showed Karen, crouching with garden shears in the middle of the night, hair wild, eyes darting like she was committing espionage instead of petty vandalism. I could have called the cops. I didn't. Not yet. Because every move she made was another rope of her own noose, and I wanted the neighborhood to see her tie the knot herself. But Karen wasn't satisfied with sabotage. No, she had to escalate. And she did it in the way entitled people always do, by trying to bend authority to her will. Thursday afternoon, I was in the garage replacing the irrigation lock when a knock rattled the front door. I opened it to find 2 uniformed police officers standing on the porch. One was older, stone-faced. The other was younger, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir," the older one said, "we received a report of stolen property being stored in this residence." I blinked. Stolen property? Specifically, power tools and construction equipment reported missing from multiple homes in this subdivision. Behind them, across the street, Karen stood with her arms crossed, a smug smile plastered across her face. I almost laughed. Instead, I stepped aside. "By all means. Come take a look." The younger officer hesitated. "You're giving us permission to search?" "Absolutely. You won't find anything that doesn't belong here." We walked through the garage, the shed, the backyard. The officers checked shelves, bins, even the trunk of my truck. Nothing. Because, of course, there was nothing. Finally, the younger cop muttered, "It's clean." The older officer turned to Karen, who had followed at a distance like a director waiting for applause. "Ma'am, there's nothing here." Her smile faltered. "You're not looking hard enough. He hides things. He has alarms to cover his tracks." The officer's jaw tightened. "False reports are a serious offense, ma'am. This is the second time this month you've dragged us here over nothing." Karen sputtered, her eyes darting between them and me. "You're all blind. He's dangerous." The older cop sighed. "We'll be filing a report. Next time, you'd better have actual evidence." They left. Karen stood frozen, fury radiating off her in wave. I gave her a little wave. "Thanks for the house checkup. Saved me calling pest control." Her face turned crimson. She stormed back inside without a word. I thought that would be the end of it, at least for a while. But I underestimated just how badly she needed to win. 2 nights later, the alarm blared again. I pulled up the camera feed, expecting to see Karen prowling around with her flashlight. What I saw instead froze me. 2 men in contractor uniforms were inside my garage, rummaging through toolboxes. One carried a crowbar, the other a duffel bag. They weren't neighbors. I'd never seen them before. And standing just outside the garage, whispering instructions like a field commander, was Karen. I hit the panic button on my phone. Sirens wailed, lights flashed, and the cops were called instantly. The men bolted, dropping tools as they ran. Karen, realizing the cameras had her dead to rights, sprinted after them, robe flapping. By the time officers arrived, the intruders were gone. But the footage was crystal clear. 2 men breaking in. And Karen outside, directing them. The cops didn't even bother questioning me this time. They went straight to Karen's house. I watched from my porch as they knocked. Greg opened the door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Karen appeared behind him, hair wild, voice shrill. She argued, gestured, denied. But the officers had already seen the footage. They left with copies, promising to follow up with investigators. For the first time, Karen didn't strut. She retreated. The neighborhood buzzed the next day. People clustered in driveways, whispering about the break-in. Someone stopped me at the mailbox. "Is it true Karen hired people to break into your garage?" "Don't know about hired," I said. "But she was definitely there." Word spread fast. By evening, half the street had seen the footage. Karen's empire was crumbling in real time. Greg approached me that night, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes hollow. She's out of control. I tried to stop her. She wouldn't listen. You knew about the break-in? He shook his head. I knew she was planning something, but not that. She kept saying if the HOA couldn't punish you, she'd make sure someone did. Greg, she crossed the line from nuisance to felony. He nodded slowly. I know. And I think she knows it too. But she's not going to stop until she drags us both down. I studied him. He wasn't just scared anymore. He was broken. Living with Karen had hollowed him out, and now he was just waiting for the collapse. Then maybe, I said, it's time to let her collapse. For the first time, he didn't argue. That night, I reviewed the footage again. Karen, standing outside my garage, whispering orders to strangers like she was running a sting operation. It was damning, undeniable, and perfect. I saved multiple copies, uploaded them to a secure drive, and sent one to Feldman, the HOA president. He replied almost instantly, "This changes everything. Emergency board meeting tomorrow." When the neighborhood woke up, Karen wasn't the queen anymore. She was the defendant. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening, and by noon the clubhouse parking lot was already overflowing. Neighbors who hadn't set foot in an HOA gathering in years dragged lawn chairs across the grass, murmuring like townsfolk gathering for a public trial. I arrived a few minutes early with a USB drive tucked into my pocket. Feldman, the HOA president, waved me over. His face was grim but steady. "We've got your footage queued up. I don't think anyone's going to dispute what they see." Inside, the board table was packed. Karen sat at the far end, shoulders squared, jaw tight. She wasn't the smug monarch I'd come to know. She looked cornered, but there was still a dangerous spark in her eyes, the kind people get when they're too stubborn to admit the game is over. Greg sat behind her, slumped like a shadow, his gaze fixed on the floor. When the room quieted, Feldman cleared his throat. "This emergency session is to address serious allegations regarding board member Karen Collins. Evidence has been submitted indicating she participated in, and potentially orchestrated, a criminal break-in at a neighbor's property." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face reddened. She sprang to her feet. "This is a farce. A smear campaign. She jabbed a finger at me, has manipulated everyone here into believing he's some kind of victim when he's the real threat." Feldman held up a hand. "You'll have a chance to speak. But first, the evidence." The lights dimmed and the projector flickered on. The footage played. 2 men in contractor uniforms breaking into my garage, stuffing tools into a bag. And there, standing just outside, Karen herself, whispering instructions, pointing toward shelves, gesturing for them to hurry. Her voice was faint but audible. "Check the boxes, he hides things there." The room erupted. Some neighbors gasped. Others muttered curses. Someone in the back whispered loudly, "Unbelievable." Karen leapt up again. "That's doctored. He fabricated that footage to frame me." I stood slowly. I gave the original files to the police and to Feldman here. 3 separate copies, each directly from the system. You're welcome to have them analyzed, but unless you think I hired actors who look exactly like you, your robe, and your slippers, the evidence is pretty clear. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Karen's face twisted, caught between rage and panic. Feldman's voice was firm. "Given this evidence, the board will vote on immediate removal of Karen Collins from her position and referral of this matter to law enforcement." Karen slammed her fists on the table. "You can't do this. I am the HOA. Without me this neighborhood will fall apart." From the back, Mrs. Patterson, the same woman Karen once claimed nearly had a heart attack from my alarm, stood shakily. "No, Karen. Without you, maybe we'll finally have peace." Applause broke out. Not loud at first, but it grew, spreading across the room until nearly everyone was clapping. Except Greg, who just buried his face in his hands. Feldman banged the gavel. "All in favor of removal?" Every hand around the board table shot up. Motion carried. Karen spun to the crowd, eyes wild. You'll regret this. You'll all regret turning on me. Two officers standing at the back stepped forward. Ma'am, we need you to come with us to answer some questions. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at Greg, but he didn't move. For the first time, she had no one left to command. The officers escorted her out. The room buzzed like a hive freed of its queen. But victory wasn't as sweet as I expected. Because as the crowd dispersed, Greg approached me, his face pale. You think it's over, he said quietly. She's on her way to the station. Pretty sure that's what over looks like. He shook his head. You don't know her. She'll twist this. She'll find some way to make herself the victim. I frowned. Greg, she was caught on camera directing a break-in. He looked up, eyes hollow. She'll say I forced her. That I planned it. She's already rehearsing it in her head. And people will believe her, because they always have. I studied him. This wasn't paranoia. This was a man who had lived in her shadow for too long, who knew exactly how far she'd go to keep control. And sure enough, the next day the fallout began. Local news vans parked at the entrance of the subdivision. Reporters swarmed the sidewalks, shoving microphones at anyone willing to talk. Karen, released pending investigation, stood on her lawn with perfectly styled hair and crocodile tears, telling anyone who would listen that she was a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by a vindictive neighbor and a controlling husband. She pointed at Greg during one interview. He pressured me into everything. He's been abusive for years. I was scared to say no. Greg just stood there, silent, hollowed out completely. I watched from my porch, jaw tight. It was a new tactic. If she couldn't be the queen, she'd be the martyr. And if throwing her husband under the bus bought her sympathy, so be it. Neighbors weren't buying it, though. One by one, they began to speak to reporters too. The man with the cane told them about the shed door she fined him for. A mother described how Karen tried to shut down her kid's lemonade stand. Even Mrs. Patterson spoke, her voice trembling but firm. She's been terrorizing us for years. He's the only one who stood up to her. Karen's narrative cracked, but she didn't care. She doubled down, filing a restraining order against me, claiming I harassed her, stalked her, and manipulated the entire community into hating her. When the papers were served, I couldn't help but laugh. My lawyer, yes, by then I had one, smirked as he flipped through them. Don't worry. These won't hold. The evidence is stacked against her. But the point wasn't to win in court. The point was to drag me through as much mud as possible, to bleed me dry with attention, time, and money. Karen wasn't fighting for power anymore. She was fighting to survive the collapse of her own empire, and she was willing to scorch earth to do it. That night, as I sat reviewing security footage yet again, Greg knocked on my door. He looked worse than ever. She's not stopping, he whispered. I know. He swallowed hard. I'm leaving her. I blinked. For a moment I thought I'd misheard. I can't stay, he said. Not after this. Not after she tried to pin everything on me. I've defended her for years, even when I knew she was wrong. But this, his voice cracked. This was too far. I nodded slowly. You'll have support. People see the truth now. But he shook his head. You don't understand. She'll come after you harder. She'll come after me harder. She's losing everything, and when she loses, she burns. I leaned back, the weight of it settling. He was right. Karen wasn't just desperate, she was dangerous. And if the last few weeks had taught me anything, it was that a cornered Karen was the most volatile of all. When Greg left, I sat in the quiet for a long time, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Then my phone buzzed. An email alert. No subject line. No sender listed. Just one attachment. A grainy still shot from my security footage. It was of me, standing in my own garage. And the timestamp had been altered to make it look like I was the one breaking in. Karen's final counterattack had begun. The fake screenshot sat in my inbox like a rattlesnake, waiting for me to reach toward it. At first glance, it was damning. Me in my garage, hunched over a toolbox, time-stamped the exact night of the break-in. To anyone who didn't know better, it looked like I was caught red-handed, staging my own victimhood. I stared at it, both furious and almost impressed. Karen had always been petty, dramatic, entitled, but this was a new level. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was calculated sabotage. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, Mark, who called me less than an hour later. "She's sloppy," he said, his voice calm. "The timestamp is off by 6 minutes compared to your system's embedded logs. Anyone with basic forensic software can tell this was manipulated." "That doesn't matter if she spreads it before anyone checks," I replied. He sighed. "Unfortunately, you're right. In cases like this, perception is often the battlefield." By morning, perception was already being weaponized. The same local news crew that had been on Karen's lawn now had the screenshot, delivered anonymously. The anchor's voice dripped false balance. While allegations against HOA member Karen Collins continue, new evidence suggests her neighbor may have staged the entire incident. I nearly choked on my coffee. Staged? Suddenly, I wasn't the victim anymore, I was the suspect. Neighbors texted me screenshots of the broadcast, half outraged, half worried. "We don't believe it," one wrote. "But you'd better get ahead of this." Karen, of course, played her part perfectly. She stood on her porch giving tearful interviews. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted a safe neighborhood. But he's been manipulating everyone, twisting everything." I was framed. The crocodile tears, the quiver in her voice, it was performance art, and she'd been rehearsing her whole life. But the cracks were showing. Greg wasn't by her side anymore. The day after his quiet confession to me, his car disappeared from their driveway. Word spread quickly, he'd left her. Some said he'd moved in with a cousin. Others claimed he was staying in a motel. All I knew was that for the first time, Karen didn't have him trailing behind her like a reluctant bodyguard. Without Greg, she looked smaller, even as she screamed louder. Mark and I met with the police that afternoon. He laid out the original footage, the security logs, and then the doctored still. "Look here," he said, tapping the screen. "Compression artifacts don't match. The lighting is inconsistent. And the timestamp code? Sloppy overlay job." The detective nodded, his face hard. "We'll add this to the case file. If she submitted this as evidence, that's tampering. Felony tampering." I leaned forward. "But meanwhile, she's convincing half the neighborhood I'm staging crimes." The detective met my eyes. "Then we counter with facts. Let her keep digging. The deeper she goes, the harder the fall." It was good advice, but easier said than done. That night, flyers appeared on doorstep. Grainy black and white copies of the doctored still, captioned, "The real criminal among U.S." I collected a stack and laughed bitterly. The paper was cheap, the ink smudged, but the message was clear. Karen wasn't content to fight in court or on TV. She was waging war house by house. Neighbors began knocking on my door, some with the flyers in hand. Most were supportive. "We know it's garbage," one man said. "She's desperate." But others were hesitant. "Look, I'm sure you didn't do it, but you understand why people are talking, right?" That was Karen's genius. Not proving her case, but sowing just enough doubt to stain mine. I decided to fight fire with fire. The next day, I hosted an open garage night. Not a party, not a gathering, just me, doors wide open, lights blazing, neighbors welcome to walk through and see for themselves. People trickled in, curious. They peeked at shelves stacked with neatly labeled bins, toolboxes locked, cameras blinking from the corners. Nothing secret, nothing suspicious. Just a garage like any other. "This is it?" one neighbor asked. "This is it," I said. "No hidden loot, no stage set. Just a garage that Karen can't keep her nose out of." By the end of the evening, half the street had walked through. Some stayed for beers. Word spread fast. Transparency was the antidote to Karen's poison. But she wasn't finished. 2 nights later, the alarm shrieked again. I checked the feed, expecting another midnight stunt. What I saw instead stopped me cold. Karen was back, but this time, she wasn't alone. She had a camcorder on a tripod, pointed straight at my garage, red recording light blinking. She paced in front of it, muttering rehearsed lines, then crouched by the door, tugging at the handle. She was staging her own break-in. I grabbed my phone, called the cops, and kept the cameras rolling. By the time officers arrived, she was on the ground, shrieking that I had attacked her, that I'd tried to drag her into the garage against her will. Her performance was unhinged, dramatic, and utterly false. But this time, the cops didn't just have my word. They had her camcorder, still recording, still showing her setting up the scene like a one-woman theater troupe. They had my security footage from multiple angles, and they had her screaming contradictions when questioned. They cuffed her on the spot. The neighborhood poured out into the street, pajamas and slippers, watching as Karen was led away, kicking and shouting about conspiracies. Someone clapped. Someone else muttered, "Finally." Greg wasn't there. He never came out. As the squad car pulled away, Feldman approached me, shaking his head. "I think that's the end of her." I wasn't so sure. Karen had a way of wriggling out of traps, of spinning loss into victimhood. But as I stood there, the red and blue lights fading down the street, I realized something important. She wasn't just losing a fight with me. She was losing herself. By the next morning, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with videos of Karen's arrest. The footage spread faster than her flyers ever had. This time, she wasn't the queen or the martyr. She was the punchline. But I couldn't shake Greg's warning. She burns when she loses. And if I'd learned anything, it was that Karen wasn't done burning yet. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood felt lighter, like a storm had finally broken and the air was safe to breathe again. Kids rode bikes without parents glaring out from behind curtains. A group of retirees set up lawn chairs at the end of the cul-de-sac, sipping coffee in peace. For the first time since I moved in, the place felt like a community instead of a kingdom under siege. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Karen was too slippery, too practiced at victimhood, to simply vanish with a single arrest. And sure enough, by Monday she was back. Released on bail, hair perfectly styled again, clutching a folder thick with papers as she marched up her driveway. The neighbors froze. Some muttered. One man whispered, "She's back already?" Karen ignored everyone, stormed straight into her house, and slammed the door. By evening, flyers were taped to mailboxes again. Only this time, they weren't about me. They were about her. Pages and pages of typed testimony, claiming she was the true victim of a neighborhood conspiracy. She accused me of stalking, Feldman of corruption, and even her own husband of abuse. Every ounce of her energy was now devoted to rewriting history. But the thing about history is that it leaves footprint. And Karen's footprints were all over the mess she'd made. My lawyer, Mark, called me that night. The DA's office is moving forward. They're filing charges: criminal trespass, harassment, filing false police reports, and evidence tampering. I let out a low whistle. That's a full house. She's in deep, Mark said. But she's going to fight tooth and nail. Expect her to drag you through more mud before this sticks. He wasn't wrong. Over the next week, Karen filed complaint after complaint. She claimed I hacked her Wi-Fi, poisoned her gardenias, even tried to kidnap her cat. Each was more absurd than the last, and each was dismissed just as quickly. But every dismissal chipped away at her credibility, and neighbors who once tolerated her now laughed openly. The real breaking point came when Greg reappeared. It was a Tuesday evening, the sun sinking low, when I spotted him walking up the street. He looked different, cleaner somehow, like shedding Karen's orbit had stripped years off him. He stopped at my driveway. "I'm testifying," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "I'm done covering for her. Done apologizing. The cops asked me for a statement and I'm giving it. Everything I know. Everything she's done. I studied him for a long moment. You sure? Once you step over that line, there's no going back. He nodded. I crossed that line years ago by staying quiet. This is me finally stepping out. That Friday Greg's testimony hit like a hammer. In sworn statements, he admitted Karen had orchestrated harassment campaigns for years. The fines, the notices, even the so-called anonymous complaints that justified her inspections, most had been written by her. He confessed she'd bragged about manipulating board votes, bullying neighbors into silence, and keeping files on everyone's weaknesses to use as leverage. The neighborhood was stunned. Some felt vindicated. Others felt betrayed. But no one doubted him. Greg, once her shadow, had become her undoing. Karen reacted exactly as expected, by exploding. She stormed onto her lawn, screaming at Greg across the street, calling him a traitor, a liar, a coward. She shrieked that he'd regret betraying her, that everyone would regret turning on her. But no one rallied to her side. Not anymore. The trial date was set for the following month. In the meantime, Karen tried one last desperate stunt. It was midnight when the alarm blared again. I jolted awake, checked the feed, and froze. Karen was in my yard, wild-eyed, clutching a hammer. She swung at the cameras, knocking one clean off the wall, then stumbled toward the garage, screaming incoherently. Within minutes, the sirens of approaching cruisers drowned out her shrieks. Officers tackled her on the lawn, pulling the hammer from her grip as she fought like a cornered animal. She was arrested again, this time with no bail. The neighborhood gathered in silence, watching as the patrol car drove away. No one cheered. No one clapped. It wasn't triumph anymore. It was tragedy, ugly and raw. Greg stood apart from the crowd, shoulders hunched, eyes wet. I walked over, rested a hand on his shoulder. "You did what you had to," I said. He nodded slowly. She couldn't let go. Even when everything was gone, she had to keep fighting. And now, he trailed off. She fought herself into a corner, I finished. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was no fear in his eyes. Just relief. The trial was swift. With Greg's testimony, the video footage, the false evidence, and her midnight hammer rampage, the jury didn't need long. Karen was convicted on multiple counts. Sentenced to probation, community service, and mandatory psychiatric evaluation, she was also banned from serving on any HOA board again. When the gavel fell, the neighborhood exhaled as one. Life slowly returned to normal. The flyers disappeared. The notices stopped. Lawns grew a little longer, mailboxes leaned a little more, and nobody cared. Without Karen's iron grip, the HOA became what it was supposed to be, boring. One afternoon, weeks later, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching kids chalk hopscotch onto the sidewalk. Feldman stopped by. "You know," he said, "you might have saved this place." I shook my head. "I didn't save it. Karen destroyed herself. I just made sure everyone saw it happen." He chuckled. "Either way, we owe you." As the sun dipped low, Greg walked past, nodding. He was thinner now, freer somehow, like a man rebuilding from rubble. We exchanged a quiet salute, the kind you give someone who's walked through fire and lived to tell it. That night, as I closed the blinds, I thought about everything Karen had thrown at me. The notices, the sabotage, the false reports, the break-ins, the flyers, even the hammer. Each was meant to wear me down, to prove her dominance. But in the end, every move she made only proved one thing. When you build your power on fear, the moment people stop fearing you, the empire crumbles. Karen wasn't just defeated. She was exposed. And the neighborhood, once divided by her reign, was united by her downfall. I filed away the last notice in Karen's Greatest Hits, slid the folder into a drawer, and closed it for good. For the first time since moving back, the house felt like home. Quiet, steady, mine. And Karen? She became nothing more than a cautionary tale, whispered about at block parties, remembered not with fear, but with a kind of stunned disbelief. Because in the end, she hadn't just broken into my garage. She'd broken into her own life, shattered it, and set off an alarm that couldn't be silenced.